There are places on this planet where the walls themselves seem to hate the people inside them. Places where women have deliberately hurt themselves rather than be transferred there, where guards became predators instead of protectors, and where simply being pregnant turned into a death sentence for a child who never got the chance to be born. Some of these facilities collapsed under the weight of war and overcrowding. Others were run with brutal efficiency by staff who knew exactly what they were doing. And a few were never really about punishment at all, but about breaking a person down until nothing familiar was left of who they used to be. What follows isn't fiction. Every entry on this list is drawn from court records, government investigations, journalist reporting, and the testimony of women who lived through it and were willing to talk about it afterward. This is a countdown of 17 of the most feared women's prisons in the world, and why so many who survived them say the punishment never really ended once they walked out the gate. Bronzefield is one of the largest women's prisons in Europe, yet former staff and inspectors alike have pointed to chronic understaffing as one of its deepest failures. In 2016, an inmate named Natasha Chin fell seriously ill inside her cell, reportedly vomiting for hours while other prisoners begged officers to call for medical help. Those pleas went unanswered for nearly 9 hours, and Natasha died before anyone intervened. A later investigation found that several chances to save her life had been missed. The prison came under fire again in 2019 when 18-year-old Rihanna Cleary went into labor completely alone in her locked cell. She cried out for help for more than 12 hours before anyone came. By then, she had already given birth by herself, biting through the umbilical cord because there was no one there to help her. Her son, Aisha Cleary, did not survive. The case triggered a formal inquest and widespread criticism of the prison's emergency response and healthcare monitoring systems, with campaigners arguing that both deaths pointed to the same underlying problem: a facility so short-staffed that basic emergencies could go unanswered for hours at a time. What made the story resonate so widely wasn't just the tragedy itself, but how preventable both deaths appeared to be in hindsight. At Lowell, Florida's largest women's prison, investigations and lawsuits have described an internal economy where power itself became the currency. Former inmates alleged that some correctional officers traded basic privileges and contraband for sexual favors, and that women who refused faced retaliation, isolation, denial of hygiene products, or fabricated disciplinary reports. One of the most disturbing cases involved a woman named Cheryl Weimer, who alleged she was left permanently paralyzed from the neck down following a violent encounter with staff. Federal investigators later documented a pattern of alleged sexual abuse and use of force violations at the facility, prompting national scrutiny of how the prison was run. What stood out most to outside observers wasn't just the abuse itself, but the culture reportedly surrounding it. Women who spoke out described being met with disbelief, isolation, or outright punishment, which discouraged others from ever coming forward at all. Built to hold around 400 people, Gitarama at one point held more than 7,000 in the chaotic aftermath of the 1994 genocide, when tens of thousands of suspects were rounded up faster than the justice system could process them. Prisoners were packed so tightly that many had no room to sit, let alone lie down. Disease spread rapidly through the overcrowded wards, food and clean water ran critically short, and the weakest inmates were sometimes trampled by the crowd around them. Conditions grew so extreme that human rights investigators later documented credible reports of cannibalism born out of sheer starvation, one of the starkest illustrations on record of what total systemic collapse can do to a prison population. Gitarama has since become a case study for humanitarian organizations studying how quickly a justice system can lose control of the very people it's meant to hold accountable. Rights groups and former detainees have long alleged that this facility in northeastern China has been used to pressure prisoners over their religious or political beliefs until they renounce them. One case that drew international attention involved a Falun Gong practitioner, Liu Jinping, who former inmates say was beaten and forced to sit motionless on a small stool for hours until sores developed on her skin. When she went on a hunger strike in protest, she was reportedly force-fed through a tube. Other former prisoners described extended solitary confinement, prolonged shackling, and being watched even during the most basic bodily functions, allegations that, if accurate, describe treatment designed to break identity as much as the body. Since it opened in 1972 on the outskirts of Tehran, Evin has become virtually synonymous with political imprisonment in Iran. Former detainees have described interrogations that stretch through the night and months spent in solitary cells so quiet and disorienting that some lost track of time entirely. Following the 2022 Women, Life, Freedom protests, hundreds of women, journalists, students, and activists among them, were reportedly detained there. In October of that year, a fire and explosions broke out inside the prison, leaving several people dead and injured amid conflicting official explanations, an incident that drew global attention to conditions inside, even as authorities offered few clear answers about what had actually happened behind those walls. Originally built to house male inmates, this Bengaluru facility has struggled to accommodate the growing number of women sent there. Reports from September 2024 described pregnant inmates sleeping on thin mats over bare concrete, receiving inconsistent prenatal checkups, and facing childbirth in a facility never equipped for maternal care. Former prisoners have described severe overcrowding, unreliable access to clean water, and constant uncertainty over whether medical help would arrive in time if labor began unexpectedly. Conditions health experts say sharply raise the risk of miscarriage and premature birth. Located in Russia's Mordovia region, IK-14 developed such a fearsome reputation that, according to former prisoners, some newly sentenced women deliberately injured themselves, cutting their wrists or swallowing objects, simply to be declared unfit for transfer there. In 2013, Pussy Riot member Nadezhda Tolokonikova smuggled out an open letter describing 16 to 17-hour workdays at sewing machines producing uniforms under brutal quotas, with rest days that could vanish for weeks if targets weren't met. She alleged that women who fell behind faced verbal abuse, forced outdoor exposure to freezing temperatures, and even physical punishment from inmate supervisors acting with staff approval. Her letter caused an international stir, though former prisoners say conditions changed very little afterward. In September 2008, a riot at this severely overcrowded Tijuana prison left more than 20 inmates dead. Built for roughly 2,000 people, La Mesa had swelled to hold more than 7,000 by the early 2010s. What made it especially notorious, though, was the corruption running through it. Prisoners with money could reportedly buy larger cells, better food, and privileges far beyond what ordinary inmates received. The disparity became so extreme that in 2002 authorities demolished an illegally built luxury unit constructed inside the prison walls, even as thousands of others slept on the floor. That inequality bred resentment that repeatedly spilled over into violence, and for years afterward, La Mesa remained a symbol of how corruption inside a prison can be just as dangerous as anything happening on the streets outside it. In April 2020, unrest tied to overcrowding and COVID-19 conditions swept through Colombia's prison system, and while El Buen Pastor avoided the worst bloodshed, it drew renewed attention to conditions former inmates had described for years. Cells built for 2 people were reportedly holding 10 or more. Mattresses covered nearly every surface of the floor, and privacy was almost non-existent. Former prisoners described an unofficial hierarchy where money and outside connections bought protection, while those without either faced intimidation, extortion, and the constant threat of violence in overcrowded, barely supervised cell blocks. Testimony gathered from escapees and human rights researchers describes Kachan, officially Kyowaso No. 1, as a labor camp where roughly 40 of about 500 women serving life sentences reportedly died within a 2-year span, not from any single incident, but from the cumulative toll of the conditions themselves. Survivors describe 18-hour shifts in factories producing shoes and clothing, punishing production quotas, and barracks so crowded that dozens of women shared spaces built for a fraction of that number. Food reportedly amounted to little more than corn or cabbage soup, leaving many permanently hungry. In December 2020, staff at HMP Style in Cheshire found 18-year-old Anna Louise Sanderson dead in her cell. She had been arrested weeks earlier and, according to evidence presented at her inquest, had shown clear signs of a severe mental health crisis before being remanded rather than given psychiatric care. Her death reignited scrutiny of a prison that has recorded some of the highest numbers of self-inflicted deaths in the UK's women's estate since 2007. Reports have repeatedly found that a large share of women arriving at Styles struggle with depression, addiction, or histories of trauma and domestic abuse, conditions critics argue the prison simply isn't equipped to treat. Mental health advocates have pointed to Style repeatedly as an example of what happens when a country's prison system quietly becomes its de facto mental health system, without the staff or funding to match. Roughly two-thirds of the women held at Welikada, Sri Lanka's largest women's prison, were first-time offenders convicted of comparatively minor crimes. Once inside, though, they found themselves housed alongside inmates serving long sentences for violent offenses, with little separation between the two groups. Former prisoners have described intense overcrowding, failing sanitation, and an environment where the smallest dispute over food or sleeping space could escalate quickly. Independent inspections in recent years have echoed those accounts, though for the women who lived through it, the findings simply confirmed what they already knew. At Tutwiler, the very officers meant to keep order allegedly became a source of abuse instead. Numerous inmates filed complaints alleging sexual coercion, harassment, and intimidation by staff, but many said they were too afraid of retaliation to pursue them formally. In 2014, the U.S. Department of Justice released the findings of an extensive investigation, concluding there was reasonable cause to believe staff had engaged in a pattern of unconstitutional sexual abuse against inmates. The report prompted federally mandated reforms, staff prosecutions, and sweeping changes to oversight, though for many former prisoners, the damage from years of alleged abuse had already been done. When word spread that Iranian human rights activist Narges Mohammadi was being transferred to Karchak, supporters reacted with alarm. The facility's name alone carried a reputation as punishment. Originally built as an industrial livestock complex before conversion into a prison, Karchak has been criticized by rights groups for housing political prisoners alongside those convicted of violent crimes, with virtually no separation. In the summer of 2022, reports emerged of raw sewage flooding parts of the facility during a heat wave, worsening already poor hygiene conditions. Former detainees have alleged that women with chronic illnesses were frequently denied timely medical care, while protests over conditions risked solitary confinement. As Israel's only women's prison, Neve Tirza holds every female inmate in the country regardless of the severity of their offense, from minor fraud to murder. Former prisoners have described having to quickly learn an entirely new social order to survive inside. Tensions boiled over in 2017, when unrest inside the prison led to riot police being deployed. According to inmate accounts and rights organizations, officers used tear gas in enclosed sections of the facility, and some women later alleged they were beaten or restrained to hospital beds tightly enough to cause swelling, allegations that drew criticism from human rights monitors. Throughout the early 2000s, former inmates and international human rights observers repeatedly accused authorities at this facility of forcing pregnant prisoners to undergo abortions, reportedly citing a lack of resources to care for newborns. Critics argued the practice was less about capacity and more about control over women who already had almost no autonomy left. One former prisoner described watching pregnant inmates taken to the prison clinic, only to return hours later in silence. While outside observers were never able to independently verify every account, the allegations surfaced consistently enough over the years to draw sustained international condemnation and calls for independent oversight of Uzbekistan's detention facilities. Tucked near Russia's border with Kazakhstan, Black Dolphin is best known for housing some of the country's most dangerous convicted criminals. Though the population is overwhelmingly male, the small number of women who have passed through its maximum security regime describe a system built around total psychological control. Inmates are marched through corridors in a forced bent-over position, cuffed and flanked by guards, specifically so they can never learn the prison's layout. Lights stay on around the clock, sitting or lying on beds during the day is forbidden, and conversation is tightly restricted. In 2019, renewed international scrutiny of Russia's prison system highlighted Black Dolphin's strict regime as an example of the kind of prolonged isolation that former inmates and researchers say can leave psychological scars lasting well beyond release. For the handful of women who have passed through Black Dolphin's walls, the experience is often described less as serving time and more as being systematically erased, one small freedom at a time. From understaffed wards where cries for help went unanswered to camps where survival itself became a daily negotiation, these 17 institutions show just how far a system can drift from its stated purpose of rehabilitation. For every headline-making scandal on this list, there are countless quieter stories that never made it into a report or an inquest. Women whose only crime was ending up in the wrong facility at the wrong time.